Between October 1871 and April 1906, 6 major American cities were completely destroyed. Not damaged, not partially burned, erased: Chicago, Boston, Seattle, Jacksonville, Baltimore, San Francisco. In each case, the official explanation is different. A cow knocking over a lantern, a chimney spark, a faulty steam boiler, a glue pot, a cigarette, an earthquake. None of these causes connect to one another. The cities themselves seem unrelated. The decades separating them appear random. But the fires themselves share something unmistakable. Every one of these fires burned far hotter than the available fuel should have allowed. Every one consumed buildings that had been specifically designed to resist fire. Every one was followed by a rapid rebuild in a completely different architectural language, and before the flames arrived, every single one of these cities had something else in common. Something that no longer appears in any official account. This is the pattern that historians refuse to name. You already know the outline of the Great Chicago Fire. Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicks a lantern in a barn on Dacoven Street, October 8, 1871. Hay ignites, the barn catches, the neighborhood follows. By the morning of October 10, 4 square miles of Chicago are gone. 300 people dead, 100,000 homeless. But here's what the standard narrative never includes. The fire didn't move like a normal fire. Witnesses described glowing spheres racing ahead of the main blaze, setting buildings alight before the flames ever reached them. They spoke of wind pulling toward the fire instead of pushing away. They reported temperatures so extreme that steel railroad tracks melted into liquid pools. Marble blocks didn't just crack from heat. They disintegrated into white dust. Iron columns inside supposedly fireproof structures softened and dripped down their own foundations like candle wax. Then there are the things that should have burned but didn't. Wooden fence posts left untouched while every house behind them vanished. Trees with green leaves still attached, surrounded entirely by ash. One stone building at the center of the destruction, the old water tower at Michigan and Chicago Avenue, completely unharmed, while everything around it for 10 blocks in every direction had turned to powder. Newspapers called it a miracle. Tour guides still call it a miracle today. Perhaps it was, or perhaps the water tower was built to a different specification than the rest of the city. There's another detail the official story ignores. On that same night, October 8, 1871, 4 other major fires erupted across the Midwest. Peshtigo, Wisconsin, burned even more intensely than Chicago, killing an estimated 1,200 people, the deadliest wildfire in American history. Holland, Michigan, leveled. Manistee, Michigan, leveled. Port Huron, Michigan, leveled, all the same night, all hundreds of miles apart, all blamed on unrelated local accidents. What are the odds of 5 cities catching fire simultaneously across multiple states with no shared grid, no shared infrastructure, and no shared cause? 13 months later, on November 9, 1872, the same impossible fire behavior appears in Boston. Official cause: a defective steam boiler in a basement on Summer Street. The fire starts after hours, climbs to the upper floors, and punches through the roof before anyone raises an alarm. Water pressure fails. Horses needed to pull steam-powered fire engines are sidelined by an epidemic of equine influenza sweeping the East Coast. By morning, 65 acres of Boston's financial district are gone. 776 buildings destroyed. $20 million in damages in 1872 currency. The same physical anomalies show up. Granite crumbles, iron facades liquefy, warehouses with iron shutters and double-thick brick walls collapse inward. Witnesses again report strange phenomena: flames moving against the wind, heat so ferocious that people a full block away felt their wool coats begin to smoke without ever seeing a fire. Boston had spent the previous 2 decades building what local papers proudly called the Granite City. Massive cut-stone commercial structures 4 and 5 stories tall, designed to last centuries. Marketed as fireproof, They lasted one night. When the financial district was rebuilt, the Granite City was abandoned. New buildings went up in red brick and standardized commercial forms, smaller, simpler, faster. None of the heavy stonework that defined pre-fire Boston. None of the ornamental masonry. None of the structures that looked, in old photographs, like they belonged in a European capital rather than a 40-year-old American port. I need to pause here. What I just described is one piece of a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a file I've put together, different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I couldn't fit all of it into this script. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before continuing. The question is, what kind of fire melts granite? According to mineralogy, one that exceeds 2,200 Fahrenheit, the fuel load of a Boston commercial district in 1872. Paper records, wooden furniture, dry goods, textiles, cannot physically produce that temperature in open air. You need an accelerant. You need an industrial heat source. You need something other than what the official story admits. 17 years after Boston, on June 6, 1889, Seattle's commercial center ignites. Cabinet maker's apprentice named John Bach heats glue in a pot over a gasoline stove in a basement workshop at First Avenue and Madison. The glue boils over. Flames catch wood shavings. The shop catches. The block catches. 25 blocks catch. By morning, Seattle's entire commercial center is gone. Standard story, standard explanation, standard rebuild. Except for one detail historians mention but never explain. Before the fire, Seattle's downtown sat at a certain elevation. After the fire, the city decided to raise the entire downtown's ground level by an average of 1 full story. In some places, 2. Existing first-floor doorways were buried and became basement windows. Existing storefronts were sealed off and became underground hallways. The old street level, cobblestones, sidewalks, lower building facades that had survived the fire, all of it was buried, paved over, and forgotten. Today, in Pioneer Square, you can pay for a guided tour of underground Seattle. You can stand in front of pre-1889 buildings, look up, and see daylight through what used to be public sidewalks. Entire blocks exist down there. Cobblestone streets, storefronts, brick arches, cast iron columns. The official explanation is that the new ground level improved drainage and sewage flow. That's a lot of justification for burying a city instead of restoring it. You don't bury a city you're proud of. 12 years after Seattle, on May 3, 1901, the same pattern repeats in Jacksonville, Florida. Sparks from a chimney at the Cleveland fiber factory blow into Spanish moss laid out to dry. By the time the first alarm rings, the fire is already a city block wide. By the time the fire department arrives, 3 blocks wide. By the time the wind shifts, it's consuming entire neighborhoods. In 8 hours, 146 city blocks and 2,300 buildings are destroyed, most of downtown Jacksonville. 10,000 people lose their homes. The smoke column is visible from Savannah, Georgia, 200 miles north. For perspective, the Great Chicago Fire took 36 hours to burn 4 square miles. Jacksonville burned a comparable area in less than a quarter of that time. Witnesses described the fire jumping multiple buildings at once, igniting rooftops before flames reached the ground, rolling across the city in waves. Temperatures again exceeded what ordinary fuel can produce. The Florida Times-Union printed accounts of brick walls glowing red from within before any visible flame had reached them. Cast iron stoves melted into puddles before the homes themselves caught fire. The Duval County Courthouse, a massive stone structure at the edge of the burn zone, collapsed before the fire had visibly reached its block. Jacksonville was rebuilt with a speed that doesn't match the labor force or material supply of a southern city in 1901. Within 2 years, downtown was operational again. New street plan, new architectural style, new zoning, Almost no trace of the pre-fire city remained. Compare photographs of Jacksonville from the 1890s with photographs from 1905. You are not looking at the same city in different decades. You are looking at two entirely different cities. Not improved, not modernized. Replaced 3 years after Jacksonville. On February 7, 1904, Baltimore goes the same way. A discarded cigarette, or possibly a spark from an electrical fault, lands inside a warehouse on Liberty Street. The warehouse catches in the early morning. The block catches by sunrise. By the next afternoon, 500 buildings across 70 city blocks are destroyed. Baltimore's entire central business district is gone in 30 hours. This fire is the one historians study most closely because more of it was photographed than any of the others. And the photographs are where the official story collapses. You see buildings that lost their entire facades but kept their interior framing. Iron structural columns standing alone in empty lots, blackened but intact, while the brick and stone around them has turned to powder. Arched stone doorways still standing while the buildings they belong to have vanished. Entire street grids of nothing but ash, with isolated columns and partial walls rising like ribs from a skeleton. Fires don't do that. Fires consume materials in a predictable order. Wood first, then fabric, paper, oils, then contents, then structural wood. Brick and stone are the last to go. And only if the fire burns for days at extreme temperatures. You never get a fire that vaporizes brick walls while leaving cast iron columns standing nearby. Iron melts at 2,800 Fahrenheit. Brick can survive up to 3,200 Fahrenheit. If the iron is still standing, the brick should be too. Unless the heat source wasn't the fire itself. Another detail from Baltimore. Telegraph poles a full mile from the main burn zone caught fire from the top down, cross beams igniting while the lower parts of the poles remained untouched. Witnesses on rooftops 3 blocks away reported sudden waves of heat lasting only seconds. Like an oven door somewhere above them opening and closing, the rebuild happened in 3 years, 70 city blocks, new zoning, wider streets, new building codes, new architectural styles. The Baltimore that exists today, almost all of it in the downtown core, dates from after February 1904. The city that came before, growing for 2 centuries since its founding in 1729, is gone. The brickwork, the cobblestones, the federal architecture, the Greek Revival civic buildings, the colonial-era warehouses. All of it in 30 hours. And nobody seems particularly curious about how, 2 years and 2 months after Baltimore, on April 18, 1906, at 5:12 in the morning, the ground in San Francisco begins to shake. The earthquake lasts between 45 and 60 seconds, with aftershocks throughout the day. Damage is severe but localized. Unreinforced masonry buildings come down, chimneys collapse. Some wooden Victorian houses slide off their foundations. But most of San Francisco is structurally intact when the shaking stops. Then the fires start, and they don't stop for 4 full days. By April 22nd, 4 square miles of San Francisco are reduced to ash. 28,000 buildings, 500 city blocks. 3,000 confirmed dead, though the real number is believed to be much higher. 250,000 people, more than half the city's population, are left homeless, the official cause. Gas mains ruptured by the earthquake, combined with broken water pipes. But here's what doesn't add up. The earthquake hit at 5:12 a.m. The first major fires were reported within minutes of the shaking stopping. Gas mains in 1906 didn't carry continuous high pressure like modern systems. They pressurized when households turned on their stoves and heaters. At 5:12 a.m., most San Franciscans were still asleep. The pipes that supposedly ruptured shouldn't have had enough pressure to produce ignition. Then there's the water. San Francisco had multiple independent water sources fed by separate systems designed so damage to one wouldn't disable all of them. The earthquake broke some mains. It didn't break all of them. Yet firefighters reported zero water pressure across the entire city within hours, every hydrant dry, almost as if the water lines had been drained on purpose. The U.S. Army was deployed within hours and began dynamiting buildings to create fire breaks. Witnesses, including newspaper reporters and federal officials, reported that some of the buildings the Army dynamited weren't on fire, weren't in the fire's projected path, and in some cases were significant municipal or historical structures. The official explanation is that the soldiers were inexperienced with demolitions. But the buildings that got dynamited tended to share certain features: older construction, pre-American or pre-statehood styles, structures that didn't match the surrounding city in design or age. Then San Francisco was rebuilt. It went up faster than the construction technology of the time allows. Within 9 years, by 1915, the city was not only rebuilt but expanded. 28,000 buildings replaced. New street grids, new downtown core, a complete urban transformation in less than a decade. The 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition is itself another piece of this story. 635 acres of constructed buildings, most of them demolished within a year of the fair closing. Photographs of the exposition show massive domed structures rising hundreds of feet, intricate sculptural ornamentation, palaces that look like they belong in classical Rome or imperial Vienna rather than a recovering earthquake city. The amount of a construction the West Coast performed between 1906 and 1915 does not add up to the workforce, materials, or budget of the period. But the photographs say it happened. And then a lot of it was unhappened. 6 cities, 35 years. Same temperatures, same impossible destruction profiles, same rapid rebuilds in completely different architectural styles than what burned. What did they have in common before the fires? Look at the photographs of these cities before they burned. Really look. Chicago in the 1860s, Boston in the 1870s, Seattle in the 1880s, Jacksonville in the 1890s, Baltimore at the turn of the century, San Francisco in 1905. You see buildings that don't match the construction technology and labor supply of the period. Massive domes on ordinary civic structures. Cast iron facades with detail work that would have taken a skilled craftsman months or years to produce by hand. The towers and cupolas on commercial buildings owned by lumber merchants and shipping clerks. Decorative stonework on warehouses and freight depots. Cathedral-scale architecture in cities that, according to the historical record, had only existed as American settlements for a few decades. San Francisco was officially settled by Americans in 1846. The gold rush hit in 1849. 60 years later, in 1906, the city had hundreds of monumental structures. Ornate civic buildings, stone churches with stained glass and bell towers, an architectural complexity that European cities had taken 5 or 6 centuries to develop. Where did the labor come from? Where did the wealth come from? Where did the architectural plans come from? Where did the construction expertise come from to build neoclassical palaces and Romanesque cathedrals in a city that had been a Spanish mission village 40 years earlier? The same questions apply to Seattle, founded in 1851, to Chicago, incorporated in 1837, to every city on this list. The answer mainstream history gives is that 19th century America was rich, ambitious, skilled at imitating European architecture, that immigrants brought old world expertise, that railroad and shipping wealth funded an unprecedented building boom. The problem is the timelines don't fit. The wealth didn't appear fast enough, the population didn't grow fast enough. The skilled craftsmen, masons, iron casters, stone carvers, glass blowers didn't exist in the required numbers. And the buildings themselves, when you look at the surviving photographs, don't match what 1860s and 1870s American workers were demonstrably producing in other cities at the same time. Then they all burned. And what rose in their place looks exactly like what you'd expect from 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s American industrial construction. Standardized brick commercial blocks. Steel frame office buildings. Practical, repeatable, fast to erect. The architectural signature of the post-fire cities matches the actual technology and labor pool of the period. The signature of what burned matches nothing at all. There's another piece of this no one seems to mention. And it might be the strangest part. Nearly every American city that suffered a major fire during this period either hosted or stood directly next to a World's Fair. Within a few years of its rebuilding, Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, 22 years after the Great Fire. That fair featured the famous White City, a 600-acre temporary metropolis of neoclassical buildings, lagoons, domes, statuary constructed in roughly 26 months and demolished within a year of closing. St. Louis hosted the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in 1904, the same year as the Baltimore fire. 200 buildings spread across 1,200 acres, built fast, demolished fast. Buffalo hosted the Pan American Exposition in 1901, the same year as the Jacksonville fire. 350 acres of monumental architecture, gone within months. San Francisco hosted the Panama Pacific Exposition in 1915. 9 years after its earthquake and fire, 635 acres of buildings, demolished within a year. These expositions all shared the same features. Massive white structures, neoclassical and Beaux-Arts design, intricate ornamentation, monumental scale, built in months, photographed extensively, then taken down before anyone could examine them closely. The official explanation says they were temporary fairgrounds thrown up quickly from cheap materials, designed from the start to be torn down after the season ended. The photographs tell a different story. Buildings the size of cathedrals with detail work that should have taken a decade to produce. Massive sculptural elements dozens of feet tall. Domes, columns, friezes, pediments, finished at a level that doesn't match temporary construction. What if the expositions weren't constructions at all? What if they were what was left? What if the so-called temporary buildings of the World's Fairs were actually the surviving structures from the pre-fire cities? They gathered together for one last public viewing before being permanently dismantled and forgotten. That's a question worth sitting with. There are buildings in these cities that survived the fires. Not many, but enough to study. The Chicago Water Tower, October 1871, still standing today. The Old South Meeting House in Boston, November 1872. Still standing Pioneer Square in Seattle, partially intact, buried but documented and accessible. Old St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Jacksonville, May 1901, still standing. Old Otterbein United Methodist Church in Baltimore, February 1904, still standing. The walls of Old St. Mary's Cathedral in San Francisco, April 1906, still standing. Interior gutted and rebuilt. In every case, the surviving structures are older than the surrounding city was supposed to be, built earlier than the timeline allows. Built with different materials, built in a different style, and in every case their survival is chalked up to coincidence. The flames just happened to skip these buildings. The wind shifted at exactly the right moment. The fire department made a successful stand on that particular block. 6 fires, 6 suspicious coincidences, 6 older buildings that survived while their newer neighbors turned to ash. What if the surviving buildings represent the original construction? Built to a standard the fires literally could not touch. Scork. And what if everything around them was something more recent and more vulnerable, presented to the historical record as the established city? Again, just a question. Photography becomes widespread in the 1860s. By the 1880s, every major American city has a continuous documented photographic record. By the time most of these fires happen, every city on this list has been photographed thoroughly. The photographs from before the fires show cities that look architecturally complex, mature, and dense. The photographs from after show empty lots, ruined foundations, isolated standing walls. The photographs from a decade later show the modern rebuilt cities we recognize today. Put them next to each other, and the pre-fire cities, in their own documented photographs, don't look like what the historical record says they should look like for their age and population. The standard rebuttal is that 19th century Americans were unusually good at building ornate structures very quickly, and that the pre-fire cities only look older because they were heavily decorated. But decoration is the most labor-intensive part of construction. You can put up a plain brick warehouse in a few weeks. You cannot build a cast-iron facade with bas-relief sculptural elements, fluted columns, and figurative statuary in a few weeks. The labor hours simply don't exist for the population of these cities at the dates given. Either 19th century America had construction capabilities we no longer understand and have no surviving evidence of, or the buildings that burned were never 19th century construction in the first place. 6 cities, 35 years, fires that burned hotter than fires should, buildings that survived for reasons nobody fully explains, 16 rebuilds that happened faster than the labor force and material supply of the period allows, architectural styles that vanished from the American skyline and were replaced with something simpler, more practical, and easier to mass produce. And in the middle of all of it, the world's fairs. Monumental architecture built in months, according to the official record, demolished within a year. If the goal was to display something briefly, and then make sure it disappeared before anyone could study it, the mainstream historical record says these 6 events are unrelated. 6 different causes, 6 unfortunate coincidences in a period of rapid urban growth. The fires happened because cities were dense, mostly built of wood, and poorly regulated. The buildings burned because of bad luck and inadequate firefighting. The rebuilds happened fast because of insurance money and industrial capacity. The expositions happened because Americans wanted to show off their growing power on the world stage. That is one possible explanation. It's the explanation taught in schools. The other possible explanation is that something happened in 19th century America that we do not have an accurate record of. Something that involved cities that didn't fit the official timeline. Something that ended in fires that didn't behave the way ordinary fires behave. Something that left a handful of older buildings as silent witnesses and replaced everything around them with the cities we recognize today. I'm not telling you which explanation is correct. I'm telling you the pattern exists. 6 cities. 35 years, the same destruction profile, the same rebuild timing, the same architectural transition from monumental to practical, the same World's Fair appearing in the same era, the same surviving older buildings that the flames somehow couldn't touch. You can decide for yourself what that pattern means. The thing about a pattern is that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing the older buildings in every American city, the Civil War-era post offices that look like they belong in Imperial Rome, the 1880s public libraries that feel like medieval cathedrals, the state capitol buildings supposedly designed and constructed by frontier crews in 20 months. You start asking how. You start asking who. You start asking why every American city has a great fire in its history and why the rebuilds always look so different from what was supposedly lost. Maybe there's nothing to it. See, maybe 19th century American construction really was that capable. The fires really were that random, and the architectural shift really was just changing tastes. Or maybe history is a lot stranger than the textbooks let on. Maybe the cities we live in today were built on top of something we no longer remember. The pattern is there. The fires are documented. The dates are real. The rebuilds happened. The buildings that survived are still standing. The photographs still exist. You can look at all of it yourself. And once you start looking, the pattern goes a lot further than 6 cities.